Welcome back to our final lecture on Henry IV, Part 2. You'll remember from last time that King Henry IV has just passed away, almost immediately after hearing news that the rebellions throughout the kingdom have been crushed. And this leaves the country in a relatively calm state, allowing Prince Hal something of a fresh start for when he takes the throne. In Act 5, the last act of the play, we pick up with Falstaff returning to court from the battlefield, and as he had planned earlier, he's swinging back by to the township of Justice Shallow on the way in order to sponge off of him as much as he can. His plan is still to use Shallow as material for comedy in order to make Hal laugh. He thinks that Justice Shallow is silly, and that his servants are silly, and again, he doesn't seem to see the similarities between himself and Shallow. And this is also a tactic, I think, of someone who is a bully, deflecting the scorn off of himself onto someone else. Falstaff has been ridiculed and mocked by Hal and Poins for years, and he can give back just as good as he gets. But now he has the opportunity to laugh with Hal at someone else, rather than to have Hal laugh at him. Meanwhile, back at court, we see that the Chief Justice is preparing for the worst. Remember, he had thrown Hal into jail in the past, and done his utmost to persecute his friends in Eastcheap. He was always on Falstaff's tail about robberies, and I'm sure he was hounding all of the others about other things that they'd done, other misdemeanors. Now that Hal is King Henry V, he reasonably assumes that the best case scenario is that he will lose his position at court as Chief Justice. Maybe worse might happen, but at the very least, that will happen. He runs into Hal's brothers, and they basically confirm his fears. They're all expecting the worst. Thomas says, well, now we're all going to have to say nice things about Falstaff and allow the court to be filled up with ruffians from Eastcheap and just smile and grin and bear it. The Chief Justice is trying to make himself feel better by saying that he always did what he thought was right, but he's still sweating bullets. Then the new King Henry walks up, and he perceives right away that everyone's nervous, and he comforts his brothers. He assures them that he's not going to have them exiled or murdered just for laughs, as a king in another play or in another country might do. And then he turns to the Chief Justice, and he says, so, what do you have to say for yourself now? And he specifically brings up the instance where the Chief Justice threw him into jail. And so here is the Chief Justice's chance to defend himself. And he says this, talking about that time that he arrested Hal. He goes, I then did use the person of your father. The image of his power lay then in me, and in the administration of his law, whilst I was busy for the Commonwealth, your Highness pleased to forget my place, the majesty and power of law and justice, the image of the king whom I presented, and struck me in my very seat of judgment, whereon, as an offender to your father, I gave bold way to my authority and did commit you. If the deed were ill, be you contented, wearing now the garland, to have a son set your decrees at naught, to pluck down justice from your awful bench, to trip the course of law and blunt the sword that guards the peace and safety of your person, nay more, to spurn at your most royal image and mock your workings in a second body. Question your royal thoughts, make the case yours. Be now the father, and propose a son. Hear your own dignity so much profaned. See your most dreadful laws so loosely slighted. Behold yourself so by a son disdained, and then imagine me taking your part, and in your power soft silencing your son. After this cold considerance, sentence me, and, as you are a king, speak in your state what I have done that misbecame my place, my person, or my liege's sovereignty. So, this is his defense, and Henry accepts it. He says, okay, fair enough. As long as you continue to be just as fair, just as unbiased and honest as you were in the past when you were serving under my father, You're going to be one of my closest advisors too. We won't have any problems. And everyone is looking at him rather dumbfounded. This isn't what they expected at all. Maybe we can see a spark of hope lighting up in his brothers' minds. The Chief Justice stops sweating and he sort of relaxes. He thinks, oh, maybe this won't be so bad after all. And speaking of hope, we then get to see what Falstaff's hope has been. And the quiet part is finally said out loud. Pistol comes to find Falstaff at Shallow's place, and he says, guess what? You're now one of the most powerful men in England. The old king is dead, and your friend, Prince Hal, is finally king. And Falstaff shows his true colors. He says, oh boy, the Chief Justice is in for it now. Shallow, ask what position you want at court. It's yours. I'm going to make all of my friends rich men. So he's already acting like he has leave to do whatever he wants to in the country, as if he's the king himself. He borrows a bunch of money from Shallow to make the journey, and the whole group sets out for Westminster as quick as they can. But we, as the audience, we're already being given warning that Falstaff's hopes are misplaced. Not just from what we've heard King Henry say, but we see in scene 4 at the Boar's Head Tavern that brothel is being raided by the police. Mistress Quickly and Doll Tearsheet are being arrested in connection with a murder that had happened there, apparently. It's no shock. We know that the tavern isn't a reputable place, and all sorts of illegal things have happened there in the last play and in this one. But why are the police cracking down on them now? It's almost as if either the tavern has just lost its protected status, as if before nobody touched the place because they thought that Hal would make any criminal charges go away, or as if nobody knew that crimes were happening there until someone gave the police a hint that they were happening, that someone being Hal himself. In either case, the days of the Boar's Head Tavern being this inn of debauchery are over. All of that's changed now. And this doesn't bode well for Hal's old friends. But Falstaff and the others don't know this, and they rush to court right in time for the new king's coronation. The trumpets sound, and in a long train of nobles, we see them filing out from the throne room and passing by the throng of onlookers. So imagine this scene. It's ultra formal. It's a royal ceremony. King Henry is marching in front, solemn, somber, formal. And Falstaff starts shouting out to him from the crowd. He's going, hey, Hal, over here, waving his arms. And so everybody looks around and they see this troop of sweaty, dirty drunks standing there, trying to shout over the new king and shout over the sound of the trumpets and all of the other noises that are happening. Along with Falstaff, there's Pistol, Bardolph, and Shallow, so they're not a very flattering group. Interestingly enough, Poins isn't there. I think that Poins, who was a bit more circumspect than the others, probably had the good sense to stay away. Maybe he thought that if the king wanted to see him, he would send for him. He definitely knew better than to try to interrupt a royal coronation ceremony. But anyway, the Chief Justice reprimands Falstaff. He probably rushes over to him in a whispered tone, and he says, "What do you think you're doing, shouting like this?" But Falstaff doesn't heed his warning either. And finally, King Henry stops the procession. He turns to Falstaff, and he just crushes him. He says this, "I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamt of such a kind of man, so surfeit swelled, so old and so profane. But being awaked, I do despise my dream. Make less thy body hence, and more thy grace. Leave gormandizing. No, the grave doth gape for thee thrice wider than for other men. Reply not to me with a fool-born jest. Presume not that I am the thing I was, for God doth know, so shall the world perceive, that I have turned away my former self. So will I those that kept me company. When thou dost hear I am as I have been, approach me, and thou shalt be as thou wast, the tutor and the feeder of my riots. Till then I banish thee, on pain of death, as I have done the rest of my misleaders, not to come near our person by 10 mile. For competence of life I will allow you, that lack of means enforce you not to evils, and as we hear you do reform yourselves, we will, according to your strengths and qualities, give you advancement. So, that's a speech, and you can imagine that it's clear now that this is no longer Falstaff's mad wag, Prince Hal, the lovable ruffian. This is the king speaking to him. And you can picture Falstaff's face just falling, just turning ashen, and as he listens to this speech. There's one point where Henry cracks one more joke about his weight. You might have caught that, about the grave opening 3 times wider for him than for others. And you can tell that perhaps Falstaff picked up on that and smiled and started to say some wisecrack in return, because Henry shoots him down right away. He says, "Reply not to me with some fool-born jest." So he's not joking around anymore. The mock banishment that he placed upon Falstaff back in the last play has now finally come true. This was Henry's moment of trial. This was the moment when he could either prove to himself that he wasn't really the wild partying prince that he was pretending to be, or that he was lying to himself the whole time and wasn't capable of reforming his ways. And he passes the test, but there's little triumph in it. Most critics of Shakespeare and most theater goers see this as a sad scene. And I think it certainly is, because Henry did care about Falstaff. For all the rude jokes and the pranks, there was a bond there, and this is him severing himself from one of his closest friends. But Henry sees that he can't fulfill his duty and cling to his old life at the same time, and so he makes that difficult choice. Of all the kings that we've read about so far, Henry is probably the model of what we might call a Christian king. And his journey from irresponsibility to kingship can be read kind of allegorically as a journey to new life in Christ. And this scene really exemplifies that. Hal had been speaking with biblical allusions and language throughout, but here it's really evident, the divide between the old, sinful man and the new man, which we read about in the book of Romans and in the book of Ephesians. As a matter of fact, a lot of that language is directly lifted from Ephesians, so I'll read a passage to you from it. This is Ephesians chapter 4, starting at verse 17. Paul is saying, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But ye have not so learned Christ, if so be that ye have heard him, and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that ye put off, concerning the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that ye put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness." So these verses are describing a rebirth, a new man in the place of where the old one was. And this is what Hal means when he says, "Presume not that I am the thing I was." And mortifying the lusts of the flesh, the process of sanctification, which are major New Testament themes, are also present here. And they'll be even more present in our next play, Henry V. Remember back to when Richard II was comparing himself to Jesus Christ constantly by measuring up his own sufferings against his. Now, while we might have pitied Richard, in the end, he certainly wasn't Christ-like. we see now that Henry has almost unconsciously stepped into that role and is serving as a more appropriate pattern of what a Christian should be. And all this is to say that becoming a Christian, following Christ, comes at a personal cost. One can't cling to their old habits or pet vices anymore. Sometimes, as in Henry's case, one can't associate with old friends anymore either. Out with the old, in with the new. So in the immediate aftermath of this confrontation, Falstaff and his crew are arrested. But it's only temporary. They're being granted a stipend in order for them to be able to support themselves and not rob. So even now, Henry is taking care of them. But Falstaff is still in denial. He keeps saying that Henry is going to send for him privately, that he's got to put on a show for the ordinary folk, but everything's going to be good. They're still close friends. But those who are with Falstaff, they're not fooled. Shallow immediately realizes that he threw his lot in with the wrong group, and he demands repayment for the money that Falstaff borrowed of him. And of course, Falstaff doesn't have the money, so he makes excuses. So the old gang is ushered off stage, and we're left with a sense that order has been restored in the kingdom. All the imagery of things wearing down, sickness reigning, and characters becoming shadows of themselves, all that's done away with now. We can even hear in the language and in the ultra-formal procession of the closing scene an echo of the opening scenes of Richard II. A rightful monarch is back on the throne, and balance has been restored. Finally, we have the epilogue of the play. And the epilogue is strange in that he seems to come out and apologize for a past bad performance and hopes that this one was better. And this wasn't too uncommon, especially if the play was performed before Queen Elizabeth. The playwright would often write an epilogue that would come out and flatter the audience. But one thing I want to point out about this epilogue is that it makes a promise to bring Falstaff back into the next play. And Shakespeare, as we'll see, failed to do so. As we've talked about, Falstaff was an extremely popular character, and Shakespeare knew that people would want to see more of him. But when he came to write Henry V, which we'll soon begin reading, there wasn't really a place for Falstaff in that play. It's a play about honor and about patriotism. English pride and glories on glories in the battlefield. All of these things are what's highlighted in Henry V. And as we've already seen, those are all ideas that Falstaff not only rejects, but mocks. So Shakespeare, in the process of writing his next play, realized that having Falstaff in such a play would undercut the very ideas and themes that he was trying to get across. It's an instance where the character doesn't fit with the theme. So instead, Shakespeare had to put him into his own fictional comedy, The Merry Wives of Windsor. But it was no longer possible to have Hal as Henry V and Falstaff in the same play together. And this is, in fact, the last time that we'll see Falstaff in these plays. The epilogue also, once again, distinguishes between the fictional character and the historical figure that he was loosely based on. It mentions Oldcastle by name and reassures everyone that that man, Oldcastle, died a martyr, not like this man, the drunken buffoon. So, that's the end of Henry IV Part 2. Next week's going to be a little different. What we'll largely be discussing is the war, or the history of the war, between England and France that's called the 100 Years' War. And which we'll see the new King Henry continuing in the next play, Henry V Part 1. Or sorry, just Henry V. There's no more. There's too many Henrys, too many titles. But go ahead and read Act 1 of Henry V as well for next week. And we'll see how many of the characters that we've come to know get tangled up into this historical conflict known as the 100 Years' War.